My stepmother claimed, "You have no right to this house." So I waited until she was out of town, proved my legal ownership, and moved in before she returned. My name is Roderick, Rod to most. I've lived in Annapolis, Maryland my entire life. It's one of those places where family roots go deep, and for our family, that rootedness was embodied in one thing: the old house on Prince George Street. Built by my great-grandfather, the house had weathered everything life threw at it: storms, break-ins, and 3 generations of children stomping through its creaky hallways. It was the kind of house that, even as kids, we knew was special. For my dad, Arthur, that house meant the world. He used to say, "This house isn't just bricks and wood, Rod, it's memory and blood." So when my mom passed away when I was 20, he poured himself even more into it, fixing it up, preserving its history. It was his way of holding on, I think. I was the only one of his kids who stayed nearby after college, so I spent a lot of time helping him with the upkeep, learning his methods, understanding his pride. Then came Odette. She entered our lives suddenly when I was about 35. Dad met her through a mutual friend at one of those charity galas he never used to attend before he met her. Odette was striking, dark hair, elegant dresses, always carrying herself with a cool, detached air. I remember thinking she seemed out of place next to my dad, who wore jeans even at family parties and couldn't be bothered with fancy manners, as he put it. But Dad was smitten, and she seemed taken with him too, or at least with his money. When they got married less than a year later, I tried my best to be supportive, even though my gut was telling me something was off. My younger sister Delia warned me, "Rod, just be careful. She's a lot savvier than she seems. I don't trust her." But I told her Dad deserved to be happy, and if Odette made him happy, then that was what mattered. One afternoon a few months after the wedding, I found myself sitting across from Odette in the kitchen while Dad was outside working on the yard. She stirred her coffee, watching me with a small smile, as if she were sizing me up. "You know, Roderick," she began, dragging my full name out, "your father and I are very happy here. It's nice to have a real home, one with a history." "Yeah, Dad's put a lot into this place," I replied, not quite sure where she was going with this. "It's a shame he worked so hard for so many years without enjoying it properly," she continued, her eyes drifting around the kitchen as if she were already redecorating it in her mind. "We'll change that. A place like this deserves to be enjoyed." She had that same look she often wore, that half-smile that always felt like there was something else hidden behind it. I decided not to dig any further. I knew Dad loved her, and that was enough, at least, that's what I kept telling myself. Then came the changes. Dad, who used to scrimp and save, started spending more. Odette would come home with new outfits, jewelry, sometimes expensive art pieces. She started hosting dinners, inviting people I'd never met, friends of hers from DC. I started to feel like a stranger in my own family's home. One evening, I decided to talk to Dad. We were sitting on the back porch, the old creaking boards beneath us, nursing beers as the sun went down. He looked tired, his face drawn. "Dad, do you think maybe Odette's spending a bit too much? I mean, you always taught us to save and..." Dad sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Rod, I get it. I know what you're thinking. But she makes me feel young again. I want her to be happy, you know? But what about the house?" I asked, feeling that familiar knot tighten in my stomach. "I mean, I know how much it means to you, and I worry she doesn't see it the same way." He looked down, his brow furrowing. "The house," he murmured, "it's still for the family, Rod. She knows that. I've told her." Relieved, I didn't push further. But my gut didn't feel any better. Years went by, and Dad's health took a slow decline. Odette was surprisingly attentive to him during this time, doting on him, managing his doctor's appointments. Still, something about it all didn't sit right. She had a way of always being in the room when we talked, of gently steering conversations about his finances. By then, my siblings, Delia, Robbie, and Thomas, had all moved out of state, and they depended on me to keep them in the loop. One night, after a particularly difficult hospital visit, I noticed Odette going through some of Dad's paperwork. She looked up and caught my eye, a flicker of irritation crossing her face before she quickly masked it. "Oh, Roderick," she said, that familiar smile reappearing. "Just making sure everything's in order. Your father wants everything squared away." "Right. Squared away," I replied, my tone edged with suspicion. "For the family, right?" "Of course," she replied coolly. "But remember, Rod, I am his wife. He trusts me to take care of these things." I nodded, but I knew I had to dig deeper. Not long after, I sat down with Dad's lawyer, Mr. Hawthorne, a man I'd known since I was a kid. Dad had told me that Mr. Hawthorne held the original will, and I was nervous but determined to see what it said. I needed to know if Odette had somehow changed things behind his back. "Roderick, I'm sorry to see you under these circumstances," Mr. Hawthorne said, pushing his glasses up and shuffling through a stack of papers. "But your father was always clear about his intentions. He wanted the house to stay in the family. He showed me the will. My dad had specified that the house would be equally divided among his children after Odette had a year to stay there, as a way to transition after his passing. But it was clear, our family's home was meant to remain with us, his kids. I left his office that day, a weight lifted but a sense of dread still gnawing at me. I knew Odette would try to contest it, would try to turn everything around in her favor. I just didn't realize how far she'd go. The day after Dad's funeral, my siblings and I gathered at the house. We hadn't even had a moment to grieve before Odette called us all to the living room. She was standing by the fireplace, a legal folder in hand, a look of confidence on her face that made my skin crawl. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice smooth and controlled. "I know this is a difficult time, but we need to discuss your father's wishes." She opened the folder and pulled out a piece of paper, glancing at each of us with a slight smirk. "According to the will, this house is left to me in its entirety." "What?" Delia gasped, her face pale. "That's not possible. Dad said the house was for all of us." Odette raised an eyebrow, her voice unyielding. "Your father changed his mind. He wanted me to have security, a place to live, as his wife." I looked at her, feeling anger boil up inside me. "Odette, I saw Dad's original will with Mr. Hawthorne. He never intended for you to have this house to yourself. He wanted it split among us." Her smile faded, replaced by a cold glare. "Mr. Hawthorne is mistaken. This," she gestured to the document in her hand, "is the final will." Thomas stepped forward, his hands shaking. "You're lying. You've done something. I don't know what, but this isn't right. Dad wouldn't do this." Odette folded her arms, her expression hard. "Believe what you want. But legally, this house is mine." The room was silent, a mixture of shock and fury. I looked at each of my siblings, their faces a reflection of the betrayal I felt in my gut. She'd taken everything we cherished and twisted it, all for her own gain. That night, after Odette retreated to her room, I pulled Delia aside. "This isn't over. I don't care what she says, I know Dad didn't want this. I'm going to figure this out." And so began a battle that would consume me, pushing me to the edge of my own sanity and testing every ounce of resolve I had. After that confrontation, my siblings and I decided we had to play this smart. Odette was relentless and manipulative, and going in without a plan would be foolish. I knew she'd prepared for a legal battle, so I spent the next few weeks visiting Mr. Hawthorne, gathering documents, and talking to anyone who knew Dad well enough to remember his wishes. It took a lot of late nights and detective work, but I started to piece things together. Turns out, Odette had gotten to Dad at his most vulnerable. She'd nudged him into changing a few things here and there, like adding her name to certain accounts. But the house, his pride and joy, was something he hadn't fully surrendered. He'd always intended it to stay in the family, no matter how persuasive she tried to be. My best shot was proving her manipulation in court, but that would take time. In the meantime, she treated the house as if she'd already won. She redecorated, tossing out furniture and knickknacks that had been in our family for decades. It was gut-wrenching. Each time I visited, I felt like I was watching a piece of our family history disappear. One night, after seeing Dad's favorite armchair sitting out on the curb, I snapped. I called my sister, Delia. "I can't keep watching her tear everything apart," I told her. "We need to do something, now." Delia, always the level-headed one, said, "Rod, just wait. She's planning that trip to Italy soon, right? We need to be patient and make our move then." Odette's Italy trip was the perfect opportunity. She'd be gone for 3 weeks. I gathered my siblings, and we met with Mr. Hawthorne again. After looking over the will, he confirmed we had the right to take possession of the house once she'd vacated the property. That was all I needed to hear. The day she left, I was parked across the street, waiting for her cab to pull away. As soon as she disappeared around the corner, I called my siblings, and we began our takeover. We entered the house like we were reclaiming a battlefield. I started by moving in a few things I'd stored, like Dad's old armchair that Odette had carelessly thrown out, which I'd rescued before trash day. Delia brought in some of Mom's old dishes, and Thomas hung up the family photos Odette had taken down. Bit by bit, we restored the house to its original state, wiping away any trace of her renovations. Over the next few days, I legally transferred the utilities and changed the locks. I even made a trip to City Hall to file the paperwork declaring the house back under our control, backed by Mr. Hawthorne's full support. By the end of that first week, the house felt like it was ours again. But the sweetest moment came when Odette returned. I was sitting in Dad's armchair on the porch when her taxi pulled up. She stepped out, dressed in designer clothes, lugging an enormous suitcase behind her, and froze the moment she saw me. Her eyes narrowed, a flash of panic crossing her face. "Rod," she said, her voice dripping with irritation. "What are you doing here?" "Living in my family's house," I replied, smiling as I took a sip of my coffee. "This is my house," she snapped. "Arthur left it to me. You need to leave before I call the police." "Go right ahead," I said, gesturing toward my phone on the table. "But you might want to take a look inside first." She hesitated, then stormed up the steps and tried the door. The lock wouldn't budge. She whipped around, her eyes blazing. Did you change the locks? Yes, and with good reason, I said, standing up to face her. Mr. Hawthorne and I went over the original will. Dad never left you the house, he left it to us. Legally, you have no right to be here. Her face fell, a mixture of shock and rage. You can't do this, she whispered. Arthur wanted me here. Nice try, I replied calmly. But the original documents say otherwise. You had your chance, Odette. You got more than enough from Dad's accounts, but this house isn't yours. And now, I'd like you to leave. Her voice trembled, a pathetic attempt at looking wounded. Where am I supposed to go? That's not my problem, I said, trying to contain my satisfaction. Maybe you should have thought about that before you tried to lie to us. With no other options, she gathered her bags, muttering curses under her breath as she trudged back down the steps. I watched her leave, savoring every step she took away from the house. Finally, after all the lies and manipulation, she was gone. As soon as she was out of sight, my siblings and I opened the windows, letting the house fill with the cool Annapolis air. We gathered in the living room, surrounded by Dad's things, and felt the weight lift. The house was ours again, as it should be. It was a victory Dad would have been proud of, a sweet revenge we'd fought hard for. And as I looked around at my siblings, I felt that familiar warmth, the feeling of family, of home, of reclaiming what was rightfully ours.